Hello there. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth part of the Hartmann's memoir, beautiful text, Our Life with Mr. Gurdjieff. In this evening's reading, we're going to learn a bit about the formation of the Institute. The chapters that I plan to read are Forming the Institute, The Work Deepens, and then Facing the Public. So that's my the plan for this evening. And in the previous episode, we read about Thomas de Hartmann contracting typhoid, which was very serious for him, and also that if his wife Olga de Hartmann didn't force or have such a strong will to stay with Thomas, then he likely would have died, because he desperately needed some form of medicine in the evening, and Olga went to collect it, and if she was sent away as the doctors wanted, then Thomas de Hartmann would likely have died in that moment. But as I say, this evening, chapter 5 is Forming the Institute, which is where we'll begin. If you enjoy all of these wonderful stories about Gurdjieff and Gurdjieff ideas, his life and work, there are many more great texts over at the app that you can sign up today. As always, if you wouldn't mind, like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe share the show if you've got any like-minded friends. But for now, we have arrived at chapter 5, Forming the Institute. Soon we began sacred gymnastics. We started with simple exercises, going on to more complicated ones of concentration and memory that absorbed the attention of the whole person. For example, simultaneous extension of arms and legs, or placing oneself on all fours, or while kneeling on one knee, having to jump directly up by pushing off the ground with the upper part of the foot, or the second part of the so-called mazurka. These exercises were obligatory for all, but some others were very tiring and were performed only by men. Mr. Gurdjieff always pushed us to the utmost in these exercises, after which we would fall on the carpets like sacks, without needing to be reminded to relax. And hello and good evening, Graham Fortune and David. Hello, my friends, and welcome. There was one exercise in which all the men had to fall in a heap and squirm round like snakes in a tangle of arms and legs. Suddenly Mr. Gurdjieff would cry, "Stop!" and take someone aside to let him view the group. I think that no sculptor ever had such a chance to admire the beautiful, complicated and unforeseen postures that resulted from the sudden stop. I did the sacred gymnastics at that time, for Mr. Gurdjieff himself played on a guitar borrowed from our landlord, since it was impossible to get a piano. He played very well. Although by nature I was a musician, I had spent years in a military school and had come to hate all physical exercises, which I found dry, tedious, depressing, and mechanical. With Mr. Gurdjieff, the sacred gymnastics were never dull, quite new, and I felt a vital aim in them. And there was always inspiration in the atmosphere during work with him. He sometimes gave individual exercises to certain people. N.F. Gurdjieff was a young man, 19 or 20 years old, who had weak lungs. To help him, he was given an exercise of movements for his shoulders, combined in a special way with tension and relaxation while inhaling and exhaling. Lena Fyodorovna had a little daughter, 11 or 12 years old, who was by nature very gifted in movement. One day Mr. Gurdjieff sat her down facing him on a carpet and told her to watch his face closely and imitate exactly what he did. He began by completely relaxing the muscles of his face until it became perfectly neutral. Then his face began very gradually to spread into an affectionate smile, which grew and grew until it reached its fullest extent, where it paused and then began to fade away equally gradually until his face was once again perfectly neutral, as at the start. Now some words from Olga de Hartmann. In all this, Mr. Gurdjieff spoke very much about relaxation and urged us to work at it often by ourselves or check one another at odd moments to see how tense we were in our arms, our legs, and our body. Sometimes he made us all lie on the floor and told a woman to verify among the women and a man among the men till we were absolutely relaxed, as much as we possibly could be. One day he told us, "Lie on your stomach with your nose to the carpet," and then he said, "Look, we studied it already. Who knows it? All right. Who has done nothing? That's your business. Now I will walk on your backs. If you do not know how to relax, well, your bones will crack." He took off his shoes and I felt on my back 4 steps going across. Probably he had one foot on the floor and with the other made as if he walked. I don't know. I don't even know if we were more relaxed or more tense, but certainly no one had his bones cracked. And now back to Thomas de Hartmann. The time came when Mr. Gurdjieff decided to enlarge the musical program. Among those who had recently arrived was P.V. Shandarovsky, a man who had come from the outside on his own initiative and who later played an important part in our life. He behaved very well, was very modest, and did not ask to be received in the institute. He said he had come hoping to find in Mr. Gurdjieff his teacher. He was a well-educated man, still young, and played the violin quite well. He read me his translation of Heredia. He had been interested in occultism and magic for a long time, and told me about an experiment with the Lord's Prayer that he had once practiced. Mr. Gurdjieff allowed him to come in the evenings for the gymnastics and later for lectures. He was very punctual, continued to be very modest, and at last Mr. Gurdjieff accepted him in the institute. This man, Shandarovsky, now had to play his violin, a real Guarneri for the gymnastics. One day a second violin was borrowed from Manzavino, and Mr. Gurdjieff said to me, "Learn to play bass notes by this evening." Even though I am a musician and composer, I had never held a violin in my hands, but once Mr. Gurdjieff wanted something, it had to be done. And so, when we were called together that evening, I was playing chords on the violin. Then Mr. Gurdjieff began to play something on the guitar, and Shandarovsky and I had to copy it, Shandarovsky playing the melody and I the accompaniment. It was not long before we were able to reproduce what he wanted. A few days later he began to teach singing to everyone who could possibly produce a more or less correct musical sound. They sang what we played on the violin. Another evening, when the pupils arrived, Mr. Gurdjieff took the guitar and made us all sing. We soon memorized the melody, and the more we sang, the stronger the irresistible penetration of the wonderful melody became, and the more the feeling of religious devotion rose. But not only in us. Manzavino and his wife, who lived in the house nearby, could not help but come to ask, "What is this unknown religious song you performed?" I remembered that Petrov was quite extraordinarily tone-deaf and unable to produce even a single exact note. He was one of Mr. Gurdjieff's favourite pupils, with whom he worked much on self-concentration and self-observation. In my presence, Mr. Gurdjieff, guitar in hand, obtained from him a precise singing of a precise note. That was many times repeated with the suggestion that Petrov should attentively observe all the sensation in his throat. And a little later, on the basis of these sensations, he had to reproduce the same note. And he reproduced it not only that evening, but days later, each time I asked. Moreover, in this fashion he learned what is called absolute pitch, and I am a good judge, since from birth I have had absolute pitch, and do in my mind cannot be mixed with any other note. This was a demonstration of a new method of solfeggio based not only on mechanical factors, but on conscious self-concentration and self-observation. Mr. Gurdjieff knew how to bring a man from his ordinary state to a higher level. At such times, all worldly desires for wealth, luxury, food, wine, and women became dim and so extremely shallow as to be non-existent. There was no sense of loss because a new light began to shine, and one could almost touch the goal to which Mr. Gurdjieff was leading one. But then, in a flash, Mr. Gurdjieff would change, acting the part of a man who had all these cravings, and one again began to sense all of them with pleasure and, oh horror, even to be overwhelmed by them. How is it that, at such a moment, the thought never occurred to us? Why did Mr. Gurdjieff manifest in this way? On the way to Uchtdare the previous autumn, he had said to me, "With a svoloch I am svoloch. With a good man I am a good man." In other words, amid the multiplicity of our little eyes are many svoloches of every kind endeavouring to outwit our good eye. We should accept our reactions as reflections of ourselves in a mirror, but be much cleverer than they. And now in Essentuki he told us, "I can lift you to heaven in a moment, but as quickly as I lifted you up, you would fall back down, because you would be unable to hold on," and added, "If water does not reach 100 degrees Celsius, it is not boiling." So in our development by our own understanding, we had to reach the boiling point, or nothing would be crystallized in us. If only 1 degree were lacking, we would fall back again. We also began to see more clearly the roles of personality and essence. Mr. Gurdjieff often said, "What is good for personality is bad for essence." At the same time, he never sought to destroy anything real in a man, only to put everything in its place. Under the mask of a bad personality, Mr. Gurdjieff became our tempter. As tempter, he provoked in us a strong inner experience of feeling and sensation, which in life expresses itself as what some call negative emotion, and then he strove to enable us to transform it by seeing it and reasoning about it. With some he aroused insult, anger, rage, and so on, until the person could not help knowing this in himself. Others he loaded with praises. "You alone truly understand what you know. Only you can I trust," until all their pride, ambition, and self-esteem were loosened to the point where they could not help seeing their own worthlessness. Through seeing himself, a man can awaken to his authentic mental center and begin to acquire genuine possibility. The true meaning of temptation comes from schools where it was created for work. Through such work, man's essence can be developed in a school under the guidance of a teacher. When the personality is made to suffer, it produces a ferment. One must avoid this suffering because this ferment, this spark, this fire, feeds essence. What is not good for personality is good for essence. All this is extremely difficult, but man has a kind of deep sense that what is sent to him is always within his capacity to bear. For those who really wish to work, the attitude must be one of acceptance. With Mr. Gurdjieff, we had always to be able to respond in the right way to his demands. This became possible if a man is present, if he has a conscious feeling of himself, of "I am." And here is Olga de Hartmann speaking, and then I believe with a recollection. Olga de Hartmann says, "We are fortunate to have kept in our notes what Mr. Gurdjieff told us one evening about the conscious feeling of one's real self. It was during the time when he was planning to open his work to public knowledge and participation in some sort of formal organization. We were sitting around the dining table when someone asked what the Institute could bring a man. As he did so often, he began to walk up and down around the table while he spoke to us." And what follows is a quote from Mr. Gurdjieff. "The Institute opens new horizons for a man and gives a durable sense to a man's existence. A man begins to see clearly that everything that he previously counted so precious and big is only a house of cards, only ideals artificially built by him or by others, or from this nothing stays. But a man clings to it all because he is afraid to stay in front of an emptiness, an abyss. He understands clearly that it is necessary to throw all this away, to blow down this house of cards, and then brick by brick to build something that nothing can blow away. He knows this with his mind and wishes it, but he is afraid to give up all his past. Perhaps he will not even find a brick. What then? What will happen? He thinks it is better to have an actual house of cards than nothing, but a risk is necessary. Without having blown away the old, nothing new can begin. Sometimes in a sudden flash one sees all this nonentity so clearly, and then a man who feels it has the right, no, he is obliged to throw all that past away, even to stamp it all under his feet, because it is no longer necessary for him. And then how insignificant all people appear to him with their little ideals, strivings, sufferings, passions, and so on. How he wishes to shout to them that all that does not exist. There is no such suffering, no such love, nothing of it. All this is invented by themselves. And it seems then to him that wings grow on his back, and he does not know why he begins to love everyone, understand everyone, and wishes to tell other people, to explain to them all that he understands and thinks. And at the same time, when it is you feel that you do not know how to speak to them so that they will understand, and because of that, you remain silent. Then something occurs, something from the outer life, and where do all those good thoughts and feelings disappear to? You begin to see only that outer life. You suffer because you begin again to see only through this dark glass. You remember all that took place a few minutes before, and you even remember your sensations and thoughts, but you can do nothing. Something inside physically gnaws at your heart, physically aches as a tooth aches. And hours are necessary, with much reasoning and many examples, to push away your thoughts and feelings, to throw all this away from you, and to be able again, without aching, to feel yourself. And here is the question: how to bring it about that these bad things will not occur again? We can perhaps even reach the point where nobody from outside can tell what is going on inside ourselves. But for what serves all this outside, when inside there is all the time the same gnawing? To understand, to see, not to show, that is possible, but how to pull out the root itself, so that nothing of the same ever occurs again. And that is the end of Gurdjieff's quote, as shared and remembered by Olga de Hartmann. So, yeah, again, a lot in that, from the sense of the intensity of the effort and how one has to work. And of course, Gurdjieff would always say that what he offers is the conditions for work. If people are interested, they can go to the Priory or the flat in the Rue des Colonels Renard and have the possibility, the environment for working. And of course, Gurdjieff would know just what everyone needed and give it to them in order to help them wake up. As it said earlier in the chapter, some people need berating, telling off and told they're stupid. Other people, their pride needs massaging until, they feel how silly it is to be prideful. So there's many ways. There's many ways to work, and of course, each individual character requires something different. And we need to find out what's best, what works best for us, what helps us to wake up the most. So chapter 6, the work deepens. One morning I came upon Zakharov at the table downstairs. In front of him were slips of paper. I asked, "What are you doing?" He answered, I'm learning to write my signature in such a way that they won't be able to find out who I am in case of Bolsheviks." We both burst out laughing. What was actually in question was the making of a sign of identity for our organization. Mr. Gurdjieff had given us the task to think of a suitable name for our society, considering the fast-changing political situation. Ouspensky suggested the Society for Struggle Against Sleep. Mr. Gurdjieff laughed, but said it was too obvious. After long discussion, the title finally selected was Esentuksky Obshteshdi. Oh, it's a very long word in a foreign language that I'm not going to be able to pronounce, which means roughly the Esentuki home of the International Idealistic Workers' Fellowship. So that was the first name for the organization. Now came the problem of making a sign for our front gateway, and for some reason or other Mr. Gurdjieff chose me for the making of signs, as he did later also in Tiflis. From Petrov, who was a marvellous calligrapher, I learned how to write a particular style of lettering, thoroughly Russian, but with elements of an ancient Hebrew characters. Then I made a sign and lettered our name in a rose colour and decorated it with pentagrams in green, the only two colours of paint I could find. When I had finished, Mr. Gurdjieff came along with Petrov to look at it. He said to Petrov, "Here on this side, draw an enneagram." But he did not wish any kind of mystical meaning to be taken from the whole inscription. We hung it over our front gate. It had one surprising result. One of our acquaintances came to call. He had seen the symbol with horror and had gone at once to consult a specialist in all sorts of dark, mystical societies, and was trying to explain to us the fearful dangers lurking behind such inscriptions. As he left us, he implored us to escape with him while there was still time. I will never forget how one intelligent and gifted young man among us was given a very difficult inner task to carry out at this time, to which it was added that if he did not succeed in what was demanded, he would be sent off to the Turkestan Correctional Section of the International Idealistic Workers' Fellowship. He told me about this, and I said with a smile that it was doubtful that the correctional section existed, but that the demand of the task must certainly be fulfilled. One evening a notice appeared in the downstairs corridor, beautifully handwritten by Petrov, which said that the International Idealistic Workers' Fellowship had been formed and that Mr. Gurdjieff was not going to work with anyone outside this society. Every day there were new notices, that this fellowship would have full members who would take part in the real work, that there would also be candidates whose participation in the work would be limited, and that there would be those who could not hope to take part in the work before they became candidates. The first full members to be named were Ouspensky, Petrov, and Dr. Sternwall. The breaking of all ties was demanded, meaning that one must not be identified with, blindly attached to, one's husband or wife, parents, children, friends, and so on. This announcement had an enormous effect on my wife and me. Not to be attached to each other? What did it mean? Not to be concerned with one another? That made us ponder in order to reach a new understanding. At this time I felt I would go wherever and do whatever Mr. Gurdjieff demanded without giving it a second thought. But this was not at all the attitude required in the work, each step having to be thought out carefully. As for my wife, although she was very deep in the work, her love for me was stronger, and she even felt ready to part from me if it were necessary for my work. But Mr. Gurdjieff always told us, "I need both of you or neither." Then came a notice requiring everyone to give up all possessions which had to be listed in writing. I could do this with great ease, as material things did not have much importance for me, but my wife will tell you herself what an intense inner struggle she went through at this time. And we now move on to a section from Olga de Hartmann talking about such a thing of the giving up of possessions. And hello there, Voldemar, who says greetings from planet Poland. Greetings, Vol. I hope you're doing well. So Olga de Hartmann says, I was very much annoyed that my husband gave up everything without thinking about the situation that could arise if, for one reason or another, both of us, or even I alone, did not wish to remain with Mr. Gurdjieff, and we did not have a penny until we had found some way of earning money. It is true that we had many friends then living in the resort, and I knew some of them would gladly help us, if only in order to see us leave Mr. Gurdjieff, though that was the last thing I wanted to do. So I decided to speak frankly about it to Mr. Gurdjieff. I found him talking with Dr. Sternwohl and wished to back out and speak to him later alone, but Mr. Gurdjieff insisted that I tell him what I had come for. So I told him that in order not to feel obliged to stay with him simply for lack of money, I wished to hold back 3,000 rubles of the money we were going to give him. He turned to Dr. Sternwohl and said, with approval in his voice, "Oh, that's it. Very good, very good. Give her what she wishes." In a few days, another notice announced that the women had to give up all their jewellery. They could keep only a wedding ring and a watch. It was a fresh blow for me. What was I to do? I was very strongly attached to my jewellery, which had been my mother's and my husband's mother's, and I realised that I would never be able to replace it. I did not wish to give it up, but I had to decide to do so or to leave. My husband did not hesitate for a moment, but for me it was a tragedy. On the one hand, I could not even think of going away. On the other hand, I did not wish to part with my jewels. I was in real torment, caught between conflicting emotions, and I cried all night long. Then the words of Mr. Gurdjieff in one of his talks came to my mind, quote, "When we die, we won't take our belongings with us, but something else, if we develop it," end quote. I put my jewels, about which I no longer cared, in a box, and when morning came I went to Mr. Gurdjieff's house, knocked and entered. He sat at a table, his head resting on his hand. "What is it?" he asked. I told him that he had asked us to bring our jewels to him, so I had brought mine. He hardly moved and said, "Put them there," pointing to a little table in the corner. I put the box on the table and left. I had just reached the garden gate when I heard him calling me. I returned. He said, "Now take them back." Many years later, someone told me I had played a bad trick on her. Why, I asked. "Well, you told me that story about your jewel, so when Mr. Gurdjieff asked me to give him something valuable, I gave it, but he never gave it back to me." Back to Thomas de Hartmann now. We had to pass through the experience of renunciation demanded in all monasteries, in all religions. But what we had to give up was only our wrong attachment to things. Much later I saw that those demands of Mr. Gurdjieff's had a double purpose. He had already had in mind a plan for a second expedition, and the liberation from attachment would be of greatest importance to everyone taking part in it. This expedition, which finally brought us to an area safe from the Bolsheviks, was carefully planned in advance. The first expedition had been preparation for this one. Incidentally, I should like to say here what Mr. Gurdjieff once told Ouspensky, quote, "Sometimes revolutions and all consequent difficulties can help real work," end quote. So, again, that's worth repeating, isn't it? Because whatever's going on in life, whether it's interpersonal, family, work stuff, or more broader geopolitical, world, national stuff, sometimes revolutions and all consequent difficulties can help real work. Every little detail was considered by Mr. Gurdjieff and worked out with the greatest precision. For example, The papers we had written stating that we were giving up all our personal belongings were used later to convince the new Bolshevik authorities that we were not unsympathetic towards the idea of common ownership of property. So they legalized our group as a scientific and non-political society. In this way we were able to exist peacefully without arousing suspicion. Mr. Gurdjieff went even further and asked Shandarovsky, who was a lawyer, to go to the local Bolshevik administration and accept work, as they needed lawyers. We were all horrified by the idea that one of us white Russians was asked to help the Bolsheviks. However, Shandarovsky went and at one of the Soviet meetings made such a wonderful speech on the theories of Proudhon and Fourier that he was immediately chosen as an instructor. In the meantime, Mr. Gurdjieff gave us some new exercises, in one of which we were given special movements for arms and legs that stood for the letters of the alphabet. We practiced them for a week. Then suddenly Mr. Gurdjieff announced that within the institute we were to speak only by means of these movements. We were not to utter even a single word, no matter what happened, not even in our own rooms. We could speak outside the institute, but we could not go without permission. Life began to be very complicated. How difficult it was to remember not to speak, especially in private. During those days my wife and I had to go to Kislovodsk, which meant we had to dress appropriately for the outside world. In order to ask each other if we had forgotten something, we had to perform a long series of gestures, but it never occurred to us to speak in our room, even in a low voice, so that nobody could hear. If we had done so, we would have felt that we had failed in our effort, that we had cheated ourselves. It was wonderful to have this attitude in our work with Mr. Gurdjieff, understanding that everything was done for our sake. We fulfilled the tasks. It was not blind obedience, for we saw the purpose, and how clearly we began to see our mechanicalness. We had to be aware of ourselves. Every moment we caught ourselves about to speak, but we remembered in time and stopped. It was difficult. Every evening after supper we gathered in Mr. Gurdjieff's room. Sometimes he would explain an exercise we had tried. Sometimes he would give a new one, which we had to try to do at once. He spoke very little, and we could never ask questions. Sometimes Mr. Gurdjieff would send away practically everybody and give special exercises to individual pupils, inner exercises. But I do not feel free to speak about them. In the morning, Mr. Gurdjieff often sat at the table on the veranda downstairs, his head always on his hand, if it was winter, wearing his Astrakhan hat and coat. He just sat there, in silence, near the door, where, from time to time, notices were posted on the wall, telling us what we were to do or not to do, what was planned for the day, and so on. These notices were very often a shock to some of us, though probably not for everyone, as I now realize. Mr. Gurdjieff sat where he could watch how his pupils reacted to these shocks. One morning, as I was going downstairs, I saw Mr. Gurdjieff sitting at the table near the staircase. Opposite him on the wall was a new notice. It read, "Thomas de Hartmann is now a full member of the International Idealistic Workers' Fellowship." When I turned to Mr. Gurdjieff, his eyes somehow radiated encouragement. For me, it was a very profound experience of happiness. I could not restrain myself. Tears gushed from my eyes. And Voldemar says, yes, hateful neighbours, war, financial difficulties and homelessness helps to keep work real. And yes, that's well said, Voldemar. And this is the difference, isn't it, between life, outer life, as we're learning, outer life, external life, and inner work life. If someone's not interested in the work, if someone's not working on themselves, not trying to raise consciousness, all of those things that Voldemar has listed, hateful neighbours, war, financial difficulties and homelessness, they could never be considered good. They're technically bad things in outer life, but inner life, we can use them. We can use them for our efforts, for our work, for our observations, for non-identification. And again, that's the power of this work, isn't it? Because we can use every impression in order to wake up. And whereas in life it would be seen as a terrible disaster, these things Waldemar lists, in the work they can be seen as great benefits. So now we're back to Olga de Hartmann. So this is Olga saying, in the evenings, Mr. Gurdjieff always asked us what we had fulfilled of the tasks during the day and gave us other tasks for the next day. Once he gave a task which none of us could understand, but we would never have asked Mr. Gurdjieff to repeat it or to explain it. That night, Petrov, Zakharov and Ouspensky came to our room and we asked each other, have you understood what Mr. Gurdjieff meant? One said X, another Y, a third Z. And only later, after all that, we came to the right meaning. We were all very proud that if Mr. Gurdjieff asked, we would be able to answer in the right way. The next evening arrived. We waited and Mr. Gurdjieff gave us tasks for the next day, but didn't ask at all about the task we had struggled with the night before. 2 weeks passed, and in the evening, as always, we sat, and Mr. Gurdjieff, as if nothing was unusual, said, I forgot to ask you about the task I gave you 2 weeks ago. Petrov, can you remind me what it was? And poor Petrov, quite unhappy, in a low voice said, No, I have forgotten. Mr. Gurdjieff changed his face and his voice at once and very sorrowfully said, Look, I brought you today something about which you have to think, but now I cannot tell you, for if the other is forgotten, it will not stick together. He meshed his fingers together as illustration and got up and went away. We were all disappointed, but none of us, although many remembered the question very well, would think to say, Mr. Gurdjieff, I remember, because we would never wish to put Petrov in the position where it seemed that only he had forgotten. Late in the evening, Mr. Gurdjieff went, as always, to a cafe. He took with him this time only Petrov. This was a kind of reward and was Mr. Gurdjieff's way of dealing with people, even if they had forgotten something, when he saw how truly unhappy they were. Back to Thomas de Hartmann. One day after gymnastics, Mr. Gurdjieff began to speak about confession, real confession, and how it was practiced in esoteric schools. Real confession had no relation to confession in the churches, for its essence consisted in the necessity for a man to see his own defects not as sinful, but as a hindrance to his development. In esoteric schools there were men of high attainment who studied the nature of a man as a whole. Their pupils were people who wished to develop their being. They spoke sincerely and openly about their inner search, how to achieve their aim, how to approach it, and of their characteristics that stood in the way. To go to such real confession, one had to make a major decision, to see one's real defects and to speak about them. Mr. Gurdjieff told us that this was absolutely essential, especially for one to see his chief feature, the one around which, as around an axis, turn all his stupid, comical, secondary weaknesses. From the first days, Mr. Gurdjieff had spoken with us about this chief weakness. To see it and to realize it is very painful, sometimes unbearable. In esoteric schools, as I have mentioned, when the chief weakness is made clear to a man, it is revealed with great care, because the truth about himself can sometimes bring a man to such despair that he might end his life. A spiritual tie with the teacher prevents such a tragedy. Holy Scripture speaks of the moment of realizing one's chief defect when it says that when you are struck on the right cheek, you must then turn the left one. The pain of discovering your chief defect is like the shock of receiving a slap in the face. A man must find in himself the strength not to run away from this pain, but boldly to turn the other cheek, that is, to listen and accept further truth about himself. One day Mr. Gurdjieff called us to his room one after another. We sat on the carpet before him, and he began to talk about how to reach that depth in oneself which alone it is possible to face oneself sincerely. He was unusually kind and gentle with both of us. It was as if the everyday mask fell from his face, and before us was the dearest man in the world. At such moments the strength and power of the inner spiritual tie with him was felt very intensely. The next week he again called some of our people privately, but for some reason did not call me, and as I thought, he even avoided me during the day. I felt I had to speak with him, and finally found him alone on the big terrace. "Mr. Gurdjieff," I said, "in St. Petersburg you said that we needed to risk only 5 kopecks in the beginning. In other words, we needed to have only a minimum of faith in your teaching to begin to apply it in our life. But if your advice proved to be good and we found it helped us, we should then risk 10 or 20 kopecks more. That is, we should trust you more and more. Have I now to place complete confidence in you and fulfill unquestioningly all that you advise me to do?" He shook his head a little, paused a moment, and then said, "Certainly, on the whole it is so. But if I begin to teach you masturbation, will you listen to me?" And he left me without another word. I place great significance on these words because they point to the essence of his work. It is not the way of unquestioning obedience. The pupil has always to remember his own principal aim. Even the teacher's intentional provocations must be powerless to make him deviate from what he knows to be his true path. Much later, Mr. Gurdjieff said that our conscience must guide us in our actions, and that conscience is innate. We do not have to acquire it, we have only to awaken, because almost always we are asleep to it. So I think this is the last chapter for this evening, I think. And I hope that you're enjoying this, the memoir, the memory of Thomas and Olga de Hartmann and their time with Mr. Gurdjieff, and all of these wonderful anecdotes and recollections and practices and sort of Gurdjieff's way of being with the pupils, the students, the people that decided to be with him. And chapter 7 is facing the public. Mr. Gurdjieff decided we should actually experience a fast, about which he had already spoken to us, but he added special conditions. He told the women to move to the upper floor and the men downstairs. During the period of fasting, men and women were not allowed to speak to each other except for 1 hour once a week, when we could go out and walk together. It was very difficult for my wife, not only because she was separated from me, but also because any discipline went against her temperament. It was less difficult for me because of my early training from the age of 9 in military school. After a few days, I could walk and talk with my wife. Just before the appointed hour, Zakharov and I began a very interesting conversation in which I became so absorbed that my wife, who had been missing me very much, was kept waiting. At last I went to her, and a very bitter conversation began. She told me that she did not wish to interfere with my work, but she saw how the work was dividing us, and that it would be better to part. The conversation itself was not important. The important thing was the suffering and pain we both were experiencing. Then, just as our talk reached its unhappy climax, as if by magic, there was Mr. Gurdjieff on the street corner. He did not seem at all pleased, and to our chagrin told us curtly, "I don't need you separately, both of you, or neither." When we returned home, it was already dark. We were both heartbroken. My wife went upstairs. I stayed downstairs. Later in the evening, Mr. Gurdjieff gave an order. Everyone was to return to his quarters, though the fast was still to be carried on. We were overjoyed. My wife told me that she had thought we were going to be separated forever, but had decided to stay at the Institute in order to see me sometimes and to continue herself to follow Mr. Gurdjieff's work. All this is a striking example of how experiences of real suffering can be provided without causing harm. When we accepted such suffering willingly and consciously, we had the possibility of creating in ourselves the real master. We certainly did not understand then the connection between all the demands that were made on us. We knew the situations were intentionally created by Mr. Gurdjieff, but at the same time we felt them to be real. As the fast was nearing its end, Mr. Gurdjieff watched our states very carefully. I don't know how or where he found them in those hard times, but he managed to obtain some oranges which he gave to those who were the most weakened. To me was given something else. It seems that on Thursday at 2 o'clock I fell asleep and slept soundly for some time. I was awakened by a tender hand. It was Mr. Gurdjieff who said to me, "Go into the corridor, there is something there waiting for you." The something was a big piece of white bread, smeared thickly with butter, another unobtainable delicacy. He told me to eat it very slowly. Mr. Gurdjieff announced that every Sunday there would be lectures on philosophy, mysticism and occultism, and that they would be open to the public. Petrov had to write announcements of the dates and the place on small pieces of paper. Paper was very scarce, and these were put up in prominent spots around Essentuki by Gurdjieff and two girls who carried paste and brushes in a little pail made from an old tin can. Several days before the first of these lectures, Mr. Gurdjieff called us together and told us that we must become acquainted with the origin of this work. The beginning, he told us, was a prearranged meeting in Egypt at the foot of one of the pyramids. There, 3 persons met after long years of separate work in places where initiation centers were still maintained. The first of these 3 was a man of science who was able, through Western knowledge, to verify and evaluate in a scientific way all that was apparently miraculous. The second man was a connoisseur of religions and their histories. The third man could be called a man of being. The result of the meeting of these 3 men was the formation of organizations of people in suitable places and in suitable conditions, such as, said Mr. Gurdjieff, our group in the Essentuki branch of the International Idealistic Workers' Fellowship. The real purpose of the work in Essentuki could become clear only if a man gave his attention to the idea of the crystallization of the soul. The products of food, both coarse food and air, are necessary, but without impressions, the great achievement, crystallization, cannot take place. In this effort, a man can rarely succeed by himself. Almost always, someone of great wisdom, a teacher, has to be near the pupil. Material of the special quality received from impressions has to exist in the pupil if the teacher is to help this transformation to take place. To build up a sufficient quantity of this material which the pupil has to collect by his own efforts, some kinds of isolated reservoirs are necessary where special conditions permit this material to be deposited. Perhaps now we can better understand why Mr. Gurdjieff called his yoga Qaeda yoga. In Russian, Qaeda is a peremptory call, as when somebody gives an order and wishes it carried out at top speed. Qaeda yoga is therefore a quick yoga, which gives the pupil the possibility of learning much in a short time. Mr. Gurdjieff felt that a man should not have to depend only on life to bring him all kinds of impressions of happiness and unhappiness, sorrow and joy. Mr. Gurdjieff wished to create special places where he could consciously provide them. Work would help, so to speak, the growth of the kingdom of heaven within us, the growth of the divine quality that distinguishes men from animals. But as the basis of Mr. Gurdjieff's work was to create every kind of impression in a pupil for this transformation, he could accomplish it only through the playing of roles. For instance, if he wished to make someone experience injustice, he had to play the part of an unjust man, and he knew how to do it superbly. Then one had to hold back from reacting badly and not be resentful. Mr. Gurdjieff told me once that it caused him pain when I was resentful. In other words, a man had to accept intentional suffering. Mr. Gurdjieff could not say, "Don't you see that it is done on purpose?" The whole sense of his work would then have been lost. There is a constant temptation for the teacher to show his true self the way he is in reality. But Mr. Gurdjieff knew full well that then everyone would run after him and become his adoring slave. He did not wish to create slaves, but on the contrary, conscious, voluntary individuals, the seeds of which he sought to plant in his pupils. And what an interesting idea there. And I think it's mentioned in several other of the biographical texts that Gurdjieff used to be a professional hypnotist. If you've read in Meetings with Remarkable Men, and again, all the other biographies, he was a professional hypnotist and an expert in suggestion. But he sort of gave up those powers and would only use them in an emergency. It's written in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. And so here it says, he did not wish to create slaves, but on the contrary, conscious, voluntary individuals, the seeds of which he sought to plant in his pupils. So he's sort of saying there, or Thomas de Hartmann saying that if Gurdjieff used his hypnotism, his suggestion, all of the powers at his disposal, he could have had great numbers of followers, great wealth and great fame and renown. But quality is better than quantity, and so that's why he wanted to keep it small, and to create conscious, voluntary individuals. The day before the first public lecture, Mr. Gurdjieff decided to have each of us prepare for it by writing in our own words the story of one of the three men who met at the pyramids. That evening we were to read our papers before the whole group. Trying to write these accounts showed us clearly how awkward and helpless we were. In the evening an iron bed was placed in the upper corridor, and on it many mattresses. We had to climb on top of this construction, sit in the Eastern manner, and read what we had written. My wife wrote of the man of being, and her essay was chosen as the best. And here we have Olga de Hartmann sharing this account. So Olga de Hartmann says, "From today we'll begin a series of lectures organized by our new society. It is important to say a few words about our society, its beginnings, its history, its reasons for being, and its ultimate results. Its history is very complicated, and to convey even an approximate picture, it is necessary to begin way, way back. 25 years ago in Egypt, near the pyramids, 3 tourists met accidentally, and from their ensuing conversation, it was clear that all 3 had nearly the same world outlook and understanding of the meaning and aim of life. One of them was a Russian prince, another a professor of archaeology, and the third was a young Greek guide. The Russian was wealthy and from an ancient lineage. In his youth he had lost his wife, whose death so strongly touched him that he pulled himself away from ordinary life and began to occupy himself with spiritualism. He began to travel and met some exceptional people who were interested in esoteric teachings. He went to India many times and lived in the temples. His unhappiness over his wife's death pushed him to travel all the time. His meeting with the professor and the Greek took place on his second trip to the Egyptian pyramids. It was science and only science that brought the professor to the pyramids. The Greek guide came because he wished to be different from what he had been until then. Before their meeting, all three had spent many long years searching, and that is why they had all arrived at the same conclusion, that something absolute existed, but they did not have enough knowledge to come to an understanding of it. They always ran into difficulties because of this lack of knowledge. That had proven to them that it was, first of all, absolutely necessary to obtain this knowledge, a knowledge that encompassed all sides of life. The fact that they had each equally striven for this made them realize the necessity of changing the nature of their search. First of all, they had to understand their aims and then begin from the beginning with their search for knowledge. To know all was too much for just three men. All religions, all histories, all special knowledge about life was too much for three people to arrive at during their short lives. But without this knowledge, they would always encounter obstacles on their way. So the idea came to them to draw to themselves people of different knowledge. Again, another difficulty arose because if the new people they attracted did not have the same interest in and aim for something higher, even their special knowledge would not help. Different specializations would bring them nothing without this. They made a plan to find these necessary people and to direct and prepare them with their advice in their material as well as spiritual lives. With this aim, the three men parted and went different ways, and the final result was that about 15 people came together. Among them were Orthodox, Catholic, Muslim, Jew and Buddhist. They knew mechanical sciences, chemistry, horticulture, astronomy, archaeology and philosophy. There were also women among them. Each one was obliged to specialize in his or her field. They all went to Persia as planned, and from there, with all their cumulative knowledge, a number of them went in 1899 to India through Kashmir, Tibet and Ceylon. The others went to Palestine through Turkey and Arabia. They chose as their mutual meeting place Kabul in Afghanistan. After many years had passed, 12 of the 15 met again. 3 had died during their travels. They decided to travel to Chitral. On the eve of their departure, the Russian died, and then, as they were on their journey, a few were taken as slaves by the wild tribes who lived in the mountains through which they had to pass. These members never reached the aim they had set for themselves. Some time later, 4 men only of the original 12 reached Chitral, having fulfilled the aim that they had set for themselves. 3 years later, they returned to Kabul. There they again began to draw corresponding people to themselves to live together. This was the beginning of our institute. People collected around them very quickly, and each one who came told the rest of the results of his or her difficult search. 5 years later, they transferred their activity to Russia, but because of the political conditions of the time, it was impossible for them to continue their work there. From Kabul on, it was necessary for these people to live together. It was indispensable to them, not for communal material reasons, but as a means to arrive at something higher, much faster than if they each individually made quite separate and unrelated efforts. And that ends Olga de Hartmann's account of her essay, her story, which is rather beautiful, sort of a abridged version and a paraphrasing of Meetings with Remarkable Men and some of the chapters there. Voldemar says, I have learned to use negative emotions into writing about it and creativity, creating stores instead of reacting while observing the tension. That's well said there, Voldemar. And I would say the important thing is the observation of the tension, right? That's the main thing. What you do with those emotions is, I suppose, up to each individual, but the observation of the tension is very important. So that's well said. Yes, that's right, Voldemar, which is why, as we often hear Maurice Nichols say, how does one value the work? What is our valuation of the work? And as Vol's saying here, lots of people died bringing this work to us. Mr. Gurdjieff worked tirelessly, as you all know, to bring this work to us, for it to continue into this modern world. All the people were affected and wrote about him. This very book that we're reading is Our Life with Mr. Gurdjieff. So let's continue. Back to Thomas de Hartmann. The day of the first public lecture arrived. On the ground floor of the house, Mr. Gurdjieff arranged a buffet. Tea with a little sugar, very sweet tea with saccharin, a little homemade sweet rolls, which were a very great luxury. Chairs were brought to the upper veranda to make a suitable auditorium. The same day Mr. Gurdjieff put Petrov, though one of his favourite pupils, through an inner experience that shattered him. Half an hour before the lecture was to begin, this strong, healthy man came into our room and began to cry despairingly. My wife and I tried to quiet him. Meanwhile, beyond our curtain window that opened onto the veranda, the audience was beginning to gather. The first lecture was read by Uspensky and was brilliantly presented to a crowd that exceeded our expectations. This lecture was followed by another one on the ray of creation, written and read by Petrov, whose inner state we could easily imagine. Nevertheless, it was delivered excellently. In the audience that evening was a deacon of the Church of Old Believers, who probably came to see whether he might find some anti-Christian heresy. He listened very attentively, perhaps satisfied, attended no further lectures. A general of the Tsar's staff, a professor of the military academy, where they prided themselves on their ability to lecture, also attended. He greatly admired these lectures and was amazed at the way Petrov could, with such dry philosophical material, as he expressed it, produce so vivid an interest in the audience. That evening Mr. Gurdjieff took Petrov to a restaurant. It was a great reward at that time just to be able to speak with Mr. Gurdjieff alone. This was another instance showing how, having given a man an intense and difficult experience which was willingly endured, Mr. Gurdjieff would never let it pass unnoticed. The next public lecture was fixed for the following Sunday, and we awaited it with great impatience. We hoped Mr. Gurdjieff himself would speak. We thought we might hear something we had not yet heard, perhaps even something about the supernatural. Our interest in magic and all other phenomena of this sort had not yet subsided in those days. We hoped, we waited, but again Mr. Gurdjieff forced us to remember our aim and why we were there. On Thursday, posters were put up everywhere in Essentuki advertising a lecture by the notorious Dr. Black. In other words, the lectures were given an intentionally suspicious character. The reputation of Dr. Black, a charlatan, was very well known from satirical poems published in pamphlets of this period with the titles like The Trial of Jan Hus and Dr. Black, Bearer of Bad News. But perhaps the doctor did not exist, for he never appeared. Why was this done? Why in the early days in St. Petersburg did Mr. Gurdjieff tell Uspensky that a meeting was to be held in a fashionable ladies' drawing room, only to let him find when the time came that, in spite of having gone over the arrangements together, it took place in a room in a public school? Why was it necessary to invent such things for Uspensky? Why had it been necessary to organize for me, a newcomer, the meeting in that dubious cafe on the Nevsky? Why now this Dr. Black? Why always a suggestion of charlatanism for prospective pupils at the very first meeting? All this can be explained only by Mr. Gurdjieff's determination to make us work, to remember our true aim, which, if serious, cannot be shaken by any kind of action on his part. Teachers usually surround themselves with an atmosphere of great seriousness and importance to give newcomers a good impression. With Mr. Gurdjieff, it was just the opposite. Everything that could repel, even frighten a new man, was always produced. A newcomer had the opportunity to meet Mr. Gurdjieff and to talk with him, but at once there was put before him some obstacle to be surmounted. On the other hand, Mr. Gurdjieff never let a newcomer go away empty-handed if he came with real questions and spoke about something that was of genuine importance to him. Another Sunday came when Ouspensky lectured. During the tea break, Mr. Gurdjieff was approached by an elderly man with a long beard. He asked about yogas. This man was the type who has a superficial interest in Hindu teachings. Mr. Gurdjieff pretended that he had never heard the names of the various yoga methods. Then this intellectual began self-importedly to explain Hatha Yoga and so on. But Mr. Gurdjieff interrupted him quickly and said, "Well, and my yoga is called Kaida Yoga." I don't need to say how astonished the intellectual was to hear about a new yoga. He understood nothing. Mr. Gurdjieff, however, had expressed in this way an idea full of meaning, if he could have grasped it. Soon another notice was posted in the house saying that in 2 days we would begin new work of a special inner character. The day was divided into hours, and each hour was to be devoted to inner exercises which we had expected for a long time. But we received only a very deep and bitter disillusionment, again undoubtedly intended by Mr. Gurdjieff. He had been trying Petrov almost beyond endurance. At last Petrov could not hold out any longer. He forgot himself and answered Mr. Gurdjieff angrily. Mr. Gurdjieff turned and left the house, and an hour later it was announced that all further work was to stop for everyone because one of the senior pupils had manifested himself in this way towards his teacher. Everyone felt a profound sense of guilt. We knew that no apology would change the situation. We had to look within, to ask ourselves if we always had before us the purpose for which we had come, and if this aim occupied the first place in our lives. Mr. Gurdjieff fully achieved what he wished to produce in us. We all passed through a very acute emotional crisis. And I believe that same story, or a story similar to that, is told in one of Fritz Peter's texts, either Boyhood with Gurdjieff or Gurdjieff Remembered, that Petrov, after being pushed emotionally and in some inner exercise, snaps at Gurdjieff, who, looks sad and forlorn and just walks away, only for everyone, to feel guilty, to feel awake, alive, to have a very strong impression. So this is what Gurdjieff seemed to be able to do best, to offer a strong impression and to wake people up ultimately. And I think that now this can happen naturally through the text, through the canonical texts and the memoirs, and also intentionally if we learn about self-remembering, the first conscious shock, remembering ourselves, I am here now, all of these things, we can do it intentionally also throughout the course of the day. So, yes, that's all for this evening. I think we'll break it up, and tomorrow night we'll read another series of letters from Maurice Nicoll on personal aim, I think, and then we'll be back for some more chapters from the Hartmanns on Tuesday. All things being well, of course. Who knows what the law of accident has in store for us. But I'll say for now, thanks everyone for joining and watching and listening. I hope you found that valuable and could take something practical away for your own work in the upcoming week. But for now, I'll say thanks again for joining. Have a good week. Look after yourselves. And I hope to see you tomorrow for another letter from Maurice Nicoll. Take care, guys. See you soon.